You're unlikely to find a more infamous house in the United Kingdom than 25 Cromwell Street, famously dubbed the House of Horrors by the media. The events that took place within its walls are so sinister, the building was razed to the ground. Its last inhabitants, Fred and Rosemary West, had shaped their family home to cater for their sadistic sexual desires, building a sex room upstairs and a torture dungeon in the cellar, where they would sexually assault, torture and murder girls as young as 15. Under the ground where the West children would play, police discovered the dismembered remains of 9 bodies. Horrifically, one of the bodies would be identified as the West's own daughter, 16-year-old Heather West. This is the portrait of Rosemary West. Before I continue, I want to give you a quick disclaimer. This episode covers a pretty gruesome case, and I'll be discussing the following: child abuse, paedophilia, rape, incest, torture, dismemberment, and murder. I won't go into all the gory details, but this could still be upsetting for some. Please keep yourself safe and click out this video if necessary. I hope I see you in the next one. Okay, let's begin. Rose West was born Rosemary Pauline Letts on the 29th of November 1953 in Northam, Devon, to parents Daisy and William Bill Letts. West was the 5th of 7 children. The family struggled financially and lived in a council house when West was born. Despite their lack of means, the Letts family house was immaculate, and the family members, including the children, were always clean and well dressed. Locals in the area described Bill as charming and polite, and Daisy as timid but beautiful. This superficial presentation hid the dysfunctional and abusive family dynamics. Her mother, Daisy, suffered from chronic clinical depression and had undergone electroconvulsive treatment whilst pregnant up until the day before West was born. Some psychologists have suggested that this may have caused prenatal injury to the brain and could explain, at least in part, the difficulty West has with impulsivity and regulating her emotions, particularly anger. West would commonly be observed rocking her head for hours on end as an infant. She would disturb her older siblings' sleep as she rhythmically bashed her head against the cot at night. In trance-like state, she would rock with enough force to move her pram if the brakes were not applied. This type of self-soothing observed in infants is often seen in abused children or children with developmental difficulties. Daisy lived in constant fear of her husband Bill. He was an ex-naval officer who expected his household to be run with military precision. As a result, Daisy became obsessed with the house and children being clean and orderly, often resorting to physically abusing the children as a means of keeping order and placating Bill's violent temper. This meant that the children were not allowed to play outside or leave the property other than to go to school, lest they get dirty. A neighbour later told reporters that she often saw the children walking around the garden in a loop. This was likely a way for them to go outside without incurring abuse from either parent for being too loud or getting dirty. The father, Bill, had paranoid schizophrenia, a diagnosis he kept secret and left untreated. This would result in him experiencing psychotic episodes in his adult life. Bill was a bitter and hateful man. He had been made to leave the Navy and missed the familiarity of discipline and routine, not to mention the status and self-esteem the role provided him. Bill would seek out to bolster his self-worth through the domination and control he exerted over his wife and children. He ran his household like a punitive military school, with any hint of disobedience or disrespect being met with extreme violence. Bill was not only abusive towards his wife, he was also unfaithful too. Bill had a high sex drive that could not be met by his wife alone. He would often lech and proposition women, so much so that he'd built a reputation as somewhat of a pervert, and there was a rumour that Bill should not be trusted with young girls unsupervised. Rose West was a passive child who would turn in on herself as a survival mechanism to deal with her abusive parents. This was a quality that Bill liked about West because it made her easy to control. From a young age, Bill groomed and sexually abused his daughter. West learned that having sex with her father often meant that she would be spared his rage. She learned that sex could be used as a manipulation tool, a currency of gaining favourable treatment, and of course, a way to dominate. Rose and her father would continue to have a sexual relationship well into her adulthood. The sexual abuse West was subjected to by her father manifested itself in West's fixation on her developing body and the sexualization of her younger siblings' bodies. At 13, West began to walk around the house in various stages of undress. Incestual sex had been normalized for West, and so during the night she began to sneak into her younger brother's beds to sexually abuse them. West was a low performer in school. She was slightly chubby and initially introverted. The children used to call her Dozy Rosie as a result. However, after being held back a year, and as she entered puberty, she became a more dominant force in school, often bullying other children. She became moody, prone to outbursts of anger and impulsive behaviour. In 1969, at the age of 15, West's sexuality had become a defining part of her identity. She was aware that older men were sexually attracted to her and frequently engaged in overtly sexual behaviour around them. She didn't shy away from older men who expressed sexual interest. On the contrary, she sought it out. Sex with older men was familiar to West. Promiscuity and over-sexualised behaviour are common in children who have been sexually abused. Their abuser has normalised sex, and the abused can sometimes develop a familiarity with sexual interactions and begin to seek out and repeat the pattern of abuse with others. West's promiscuity had earned her the reputation with older men in the area as being a teenage nymphomaniac. It is suspected that her partner in crime and husband-to-be, Fred West, knew about Rose's reputation before he even met her, and this would have made her more attractive to him. Fred West was 27 when he first met 15-year-old Rose. They met at a bus stop in Cheltenham. Fred had sat next to her and did so again during the bus ride. Rose is said to have been initially repulsed by his unkempt appearance, describing his teeth as green and ganky. Fred was persistent. He continued to shower her with attention and compliments, and Rose was quickly won over. She later said Fred could charm the birds from the trees. Fred and Rose learnt they had a lot in common. They had a mother called Daisy, lived near each other, had left school with no qualifications, and had had similar childhood experiences. His mother had sexually abused Fred, and he, in turn, had sexually abused his sisters. Fred also claimed that his father also sexually abused his sisters. The two were both hypersexual, and so when Fred disclosed his predilection towards bondage and S&M, Rose was not deterred. She was intrigued. Within only a few weeks, they were a couple. West had quit her job and moved in with Fred and become a childminder to his two daughters. Fred had previously been married to a Scottish woman called Catherine Costello, also known as Rena. Rena was a sex worker who had been pregnant by one of her clients. Fred was aware of this and married her while she was pregnant. Rena gave birth to her daughter, Charmaine, and Fred claimed her as his own. Then came the second daughter, Anne-Marie. The couple then separated and Rena returned to Scotland, leaving her daughters under the care of Fred. West's parents were horrified that their 15-year-old daughter was in a relationship with Fred, a scruffy, slow-witted 27-year-old man. Daisy was unimpressed by Fred's arrogant boasting, realising that he was a pathological liar early on. Bill was direct in his distaste for Fred and threatened to call social services should he continue to see his daughter. Fred and Rose continued to date, and Bill calls social services, who try to intervene with little success. By 16, West is pregnant and the couple move into a new home at 25 Midland Road, Gloucester. Fred had a low IQ of 84 and was practically illiterate. When unable to find honest work, usually as a labourer of some kind, Fred would resort to stealing. He would sometimes get caught and end up spending time in prison. On the 17th of October 1970, West gave birth to their daughter, Heather. Shortly after this, Fred went to prison for theft, serving a sentence of a little over 6 months, leaving a resentful 17-year-old West alone to look after his two daughters and their newborn baby. West tried to parent the children like her father, Bill. She would demand respect and obedience, and when this didn't happen, she would resort to physically abusing them. While Anne-Marie would cry and plead for West to stop, Charmaine remained defiant, showing little emotions or remorse, a response that infuriated West, who would often become more violent towards Charmaine as a result. In 1971, this horrific pattern of behaviour eventually resulted in a rageful West murdering 8-year-old Charmaine. It is believed that West hid the body in the cellar until Fred was released from prison. It was him that removed the fingers and toes from Charmaine and buried her under the kitchen floor. When anyone inquired about Charmaine, the couple would say that she'd gone to live with her mother Rena, which worked until Rena herself showed up wanting to see her daughter. This was a problem, and so Fred strangled Rena to death and buried her in a field near where he grew up. This wasn't the first time Fred had murdered someone. In fact, the remains of his ex-mistress, 18-year-old Anne McFall, and their unborn baby would be found later by the police in another field close by. Fred disclosed this to West, and their murders bonded the couple together. In 1972, the couple got married and following the birth of their second child, moved to their new home, 25 Cromwell Street, a 3-story terrace property with a cellar. The infamous house would later be called the House of Horrors by the press. As a means of earning money, West begins sex work operating from the family home. An aroused Fred would watch through peepholes as his wife had sex with clients, often filming the acts and storing them in their ever-growing collection of hardcore pornography. He even fitted a red light and an intercom system so he could listen to his wife when in session. Fred put his building skills to use, adjusting the house so they could take in lodgers. These were usually transient, young, vulnerable girls who fled or had been kicked out of their family homes. Some would operate as in-home childminders to the West children. Fred and Rose's sexual appetites were insatiable and quickly became increasingly macabre and sadistic. They would post sex ads in the paper in search of sex partners who enjoyed sadomasochistic sex. Fred began to convert the cellar into a sex dungeon, adding a bed and hooks to the ceiling to be used for bondage sex. In September 1972, the couple brought their 8-year-old daughter Anne-Marie to the cellar. The couple tied her to the bed and gagged her. West watched and encouraged Fred as he sexually assaulted his own daughter. The sadistic sexual abuse of the children became routine in the West house. Fred and Rose believed it was the father's right to break in their daughters. Both Fred and Rose would sexually, physically, and emotionally abuse their children. During their time at 25 Cromwell Street until 1992, the West children had been admitted to local casualty departments 31 times. The West would claim their injuries were accidental and social services were never contacted. That same year, the couple began to drive around in Fred's car, looking to lure young girls back to the house. West is not much older than the girls and would either be pregnant or bring a baby along. This would give a less threatening appearance and help ease the girls into the car. In October, the couple managed to lure 17-year-old Caroline Owens after giving her a lift one night. Through conversation, the couple learned that Caroline was unhappy at home and was keen to leave, so the Wests offer her a job as they need a live-in nanny. Caroline agrees to their offer and moves into 25 Cromwell Street that following week. However, as time passed, the Wests start to increasingly behave in a sexually inappropriate manner around and towards Caroline. Not liking where this is going, Caroline decides to leave and move back home. Unfortunately, the Wests were familiar with Caroline's routine. At night time, not long after Caroline had left, the couple went out in the car to try and find her and bring her back to the house for sex. Fred would later tell the police that Rose instigated this abduction. Regardless, both are responsible for the kidnapping, torture, and brutal sexual assault they inflicted upon this 17-year-old. Caroline has spoken about the events of that night, which involved being kidnapped, drugged, and subjected to a 12-hour torture session, including being bound, beaten with a leather belt, and repeatedly sexually assaulted by the Wests. Realizing she was trapped and could lose her life, Caroline decided to cooperate, promising to keep quiet and return to work as a nanny. It works and Caroline is able to escape. Caroline returns home and her mother notices the injuries she sustained. When asked what happened, Caroline discloses the horrific events she'd just experienced. Her mother informs the police, who arrest and charge the couple. The case went to court in 1973. Caroline was unable to face giving testimony in court. The Wests feign remorse and claim it was consensual sex that they admittedly took too far and would make sure that it didn't happen again. They agreed to plead guilty to lesser charges of indecent assault and actual bodily harm. They're both given a warning and a fine of £50. The couple learned from this experience that next time they would need to kill their victim to avoid being caught. That same year, the Wests commit their first murder. Their victim is 19-year-old Linda Goff, whom the Wests had met through one of their male lodgers she was dating. As a result, Linda would frequent the West home regularly, eventually lodging there herself towards the end of April. However, within days of her moving in, she went missing. The Wests would say that they had to kick her out after she hit one of the children. Linda's body would later be found under the bathroom floor at 25 Cromwell Street. The Wests didn't tend to remove the bondage or paraphernalia they used to torture their victims when they buried them. So when bodies were dug up, forensics had the body plus whatever paraphernalia they'd been buried with to build detailed picture of what the victim had been subjected to and what their cause of death was. Linda's body had been dismembered but still showed significant signs of torture. Her skull had been bound in duct tape, with 2 plastic tubes inserted and taped into the nasal cavity, suggesting the West had limited her ability to breathe whilst torturing her. She was also missing several cervical vertebrae, suggesting she was hung or strangled to death. Later, on November the 10th of that year, the couple killed again. Their victim was 15-year-old schoolgirl Carol Ann Cooper. She lived in a children's home in Worcestershire at the time. She had been to the cinema with her boyfriend earlier that day, caught a bus home, and then vanished. It's believed that the Wests followed her after she'd gotten off the bus and abducted her while she was walking home. Her fate was similar to Linda Goff's. Her body was also found dismembered, this time under the cellar floor. The body showed signs of being hung by the neck, and the hands were bound together with rope. This killing spree continued for close to 2 years. By 1975, the Wests had sexually assaulted, tortured, and killed a further 4 victims who were all buried under the cellar. The victims were all female, ranging from ages 15 to 21. Forensics suggest that each victim in the basement had suffered similar treatment. However, it was noted that the Wests had become more and more sadistic with each killing, as each body was found with more damage and torture paraphernalia. Based on how the bodies were found and the confessions Fred would later give, sexual sadism is considered the motive for each of these 5 killings. Following the murder of their 5th victim, 18-year-old Juanita Mort, in 1975, there was no more burial space under the cellar floor. Fred then cemented the floor, and the cellar became a bedroom for 3 of their older children, Heather, May, and Stephen. May would later disclose that the 3 siblings were locked in the cellar at night time. This was to prevent them from seeing any of the more sinister goings-on in the household. For example, Anne-Marie, Fred and Rena's daughter, at the age of 13, was forced into sex work by the Wests. Rose told clients that she was 16 and would always be present during these sessions to ensure Anne-Marie didn't disclose her actual age. Anne-Marie has spoken about her experience at 25 Cromwell Street, and how she was regularly assaulted both physically and sexually by both Fred and Rose. The Wests are believed not to have killed again until the murder of 18-year-old Shirley Robinson in May 1978. Shirley had been a lodger who would often look after the children. She and Fred were in a sexual relationship, and she was 8 months pregnant with Fred's baby when she went missing. Fred would later tell the police that Rose was jealous of Shirley and wanted her gone, so he had to kill her. She was buried in the garden of 25 Cromwell Street. The police later discover her dismembered body along with her unborn babies. The unborn baby had been removed from its mother and had several bones missing from its remains. The West would explain her disappearance by telling people that Shirley had left to live with her father in Germany. Their next victim was Alison Chambers, who had recently turned 17 when she went missing in August 1979. She had been living in a children's home in Gloucester and was filed as a missing person. She was found buried in the West's garden. Her remains showed evidence of torture, and so it's believed that she was the last known victim killed by the West for their sadistic sexual pleasure. In June 1987, Heather West, age 16, was murdered by her parents. The Wests would say Heather had left home because she was a lesbian and wanted to live her own life. Heather, the eldest daughter of Fred and Rose, had become more rebellious, refusing to concede to Fred's sexual abuse or Rose's violently abusive outbursts. It's believed the couple was not prepared to relinquish control and feared that Heather would speak out about the abuse and possibly the murders, so they killed her. Fred then decapitated and dismembered her body before burying it under the patio. There has been no evidence of any more murders following Heather. There's been much speculation, as you can imagine. Many believe that the killings continued, but Fred buried them somewhere outside of their home. Very rarely can serial killers stop killing for such long periods of time. Due to the time and type of victim the West targeted, teenage runaways and vulnerable girls in the care system, they could have likely have continued without being noticed. After all, it wasn't the missing girls that caught the Wests out, it was the sexual abuse they subjected their children to and the murder of their daughter Heather that brought them under the scope of the law. In 1992, Fred was accused of sexually abusing one of his daughters, and Rose was charged with child cruelty. At that time, Rose had given birth to 8 children in total. The 5 children who were still living with the Wests were removed and placed in care. The 4th child, Louise West, had confided in a friend about her abuse. This resulted in social services and the police being informed. Louise aided the police in building their case against them. Both Fred and Rose were arrested. Fred was imprisoned on remand and Rose returned to the home to await trial. But the daughter, fearing repercussions, refused to provide evidence in court and the charges were dropped as a result. The children remained in care as social services continued to have safeguarding concerns. The Wests were allowed supervised contact with their children. Rose attended once before she and Fred concluded they were to accept their children were gone for good and they would have to make more children to replace them. While in care, the children disclose a disturbing family joke that their sister was dead and buried under the patio. It is believed that Fred would use this joke to threaten the children. "You keep that up and you'll be under the patio with Heather." Police had noted Heather's absence from family videos they had seized from the house as evidence, and the Wests couldn't provide an acceptable explanation for their daughter's disappearance. It took the police 18 months to build up enough evidence to gain a warrant to search under the patio. During that time, police had checked Heather's national insurance records to see if there was any evidence of her registering with the GP, accessing a hospital, or claiming benefits, but there was none. Heather had disappeared with no trace. On Wednesday the 28th of February 1994, police obtained a warrant to search the garden of 25 Cromwell Street under the patio. The following day, around 15 police officers arrived at the home and started digging up the garden. Fred West willingly went to the police station to be questioned about Heather's disappearance. He was told that if he could bring Heather to the police station, all charges would be dropped. Fred maintained that Heather was alive and well and returned to the family home. That evening, the Wests walked their dogs, something they're not known to do, and likely a way of them discussing their plan of action away from police surveillance. The next day, the 25th of February, Fred requested to be brought to the police station where he confessed to killing Heather by accidentally strangling her during an argument. He also disclosed that he had dismembered her body and buried the remains under the patio. He claimed Rose was uninvolved and did not know what he had done. Rose is taken to the police station and questioned, but maintains her innocence. She is placed in a bugged hotel room with her now oldest daughter, May, while the police continue their search of the garden. Police struggle to find the remains and are digging for 3 days before they make a discovery of a female femur bone on Saturday the 26th of February. They continue to search and find another 2 femur bones, both belonging to females. The police now know that Heather is not the only body buried at 25 Cromwell Street. Fred is questioned again and admits to murdering the other 2 women buried in the garden and is taken to the house to show them where to dig. Over the following days, Fred confessed to killing the 9 victims that can be found under the ground of his home. In addition, he also admits to killing his ex-wife Rena and her daughter Charmaine, and led police to the body of an ex-lover, Anne McFall. He had initially denied killing Anne, but did eventually confess to her murder. Initially, Fred had claimed sole responsibility for all of the murders. He had provided hours of police interviews where he confesses to the killings but is vague about the details. When asked about the paraphernalia found on the bodies and the signs of torture, he either claims he doesn't know anything or simply states no comment. However, come the Easter holidays, Fred changed his tune. He began to claim he had nothing to do with Charmaine or the other victims whose bodies were found at 25 Cromwell Street, that it was all Rose's doing. From this stage on, Rose and Fred West are both charged with murders. Over the following months, Fred and Rose are held on remand and the police are tasked with digging up and identifying the remains of their victims. 9 bodies were recovered from 25 Cromwell Street. 5 bodies were found under the cellar floor, 1 under the bathroom, and 3 bodies were found buried in the garden. Charmaine's remains are dug up from under the kitchen floor of the West's old flat at Midlands Road. They also excavate Fred's first wife Rena and Anne McFall's body from the fields near Fred's childhood home. Fred is charged with 12 murders. On New Year's Day 1995, Fred West committed suicide by hanging in his prison cell with a makeshift noose. Rose was charged with the murder of Charmaine, increasing her murder charges to 10 in total. She's made aware that Fred has committed suicide and is livid that she is now facing the trial alone. She maintains that she has no knowledge or involvement in any of the murders. Carolyn Owens, who had survived 12 hours of physical and sexual assault at the hands of the Wests, provided testimony at the trial. This was evidence to the court regarding how sadistic Rose West could be and the horrific acts she was capable of committing against another human being. The prosecution questioned a specialist regarding the time Charmaine had been killed and highlighted that Fred West was in prison at that time, meaning it could only have been Rose West that killed her. During the trial, West remained stoic, showing little emotion or interest. Initially, she maintained her composure when she was being questioned on the stand, but Rose's mask began to slip by the third and last day of questioning. West was being questioned regarding the murder of Charmaine and the abuse that she had subjected her to while in her care. West lost her temper and ended up shouting at the prosecution. This again showed the court that West was not a meek, innocent, middle-aged woman, but a woman with quick temper, capable of holding her own. After a 7-week trial on the 22nd of November 1995, Rose West was found guilty of 10 counts of murder. The victims were Charmaine West, Linda Goff, Caroline Cooper, Lucy Partington, Teresa Siegenthal, Shirley Hubbard, Juanita Mort, Shirley Robinson, Alison Chambers, and Heather West. Rose West was given life imprisonment, which was later converted to a whole life tariff, which basically means she's never getting out. West maintains her innocence to this day. She's nearly 70 years old, and I think she's currently in Newhall Prison in West Yorkshire. This was a massive case in the UK, and the British public struggled to understand how a woman and mother could be capable of such horrific crimes. Their deep hatred towards her was so much so that she became known as the evilest woman who ever lived. I don't want to go into too much detail about the West children. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been and probably still is. However, I wanted to discuss what Mae West said during an interview with the Daily Mail. She said, "Sometimes I feel it's alright for her. She's had counselling. She's done a degree in English. Every course she's been offered, she's said yes to. She has a full life, hobbies, gym, sewing, cooking. She lives in a bubble. But what about us, her children? There's no place for us to be ourselves." I've never given much thought to the children of serial killers before. I've always felt sorry for the family, but I've never really thought about the long-term effects they're likely to have faced. The killer and the victims tend to be the main focal point. This may be a good thing now I think about it, because I wouldn't want the media hounding me if I had a relative that was a serial killer. Anyway, Mae West wrote a book about her experiences growing up at 25 Cromwell Street called Love Always Mum. It's a very eye-opening read if you want to understand things from the children's perspective. Thanks for watching. If you got something out of this episode, please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more episodes, make sure you click the subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything. But that's it for now. I'll catch you in the next one.